You can fall in love with someone's smile, their ambition, their energy, but it is their emotional maturity that will determine whether you can stay. Relationships do not fall apart only because of betrayal or distance. They often erode quietly under the weight of behaviors that seem small at first, but slowly drain respect and trust. Emotional immaturity is not always obvious in the beginning. It can hide behind charm, intelligence, or even kindness, until a moment of conflict reveals a truth you cannot ignore. We often think of maturity as something that comes naturally with age, as if the years themselves carry wisdom into our hearts. But age does not guarantee emotional growth. And without that growth, even the most loving connection can turn into a cycle of misunderstanding and hurt. Emotional immaturity is not about having flaws. It is about refusing to acknowledge them, refusing to take responsibility, and expecting the world to adapt while you remain unchanged. Here is the trap. These patterns are rarely dramatic at first. A sharp comment brushed off as a joke, a moment of anger that feels like an exception, a refusal to admit fault disguised as confidence. You tell yourself it is nothing, that it will get better, that they are just stressed. But over time, these small cracks become the fault lines that split the entire foundation. Spotting emotional immaturity early is not about judging someone harshly. It is about protecting the space where love, respect, and trust are meant to grow. It is about recognizing when the relationship is becoming a place where you feel unsafe to express yourself, where you walk on eggshells to avoid an outburst, where conflict turns into a contest rather than a conversation. In this journey, we will uncover the top 3 signs of emotional immaturity, patterns that can appear in romantic relationships, friendships, family, and even at work. By learning to see them clearly, you give yourself the chance to respond with wisdom instead of reacting in confusion. You can set boundaries before resentment takes root, and you can decide whether this is a relationship worth repairing or one you need to release. Because the truth is simple. Love cannot survive without respect, trust cannot grow without accountability, and connection cannot deepen without emotional maturity. The sooner you can see the signs, the sooner you can choose the path that leads not just to love, but to a love that lasts. One of the clearest signs of emotional immaturity is the inability to control impulses. Impulse control is the skill of pausing between feeling and acting, the ability to think before you speak, and to choose your response rather than letting your emotions decide for you. When this skill is missing, emotions spill out unfiltered, often in ways that cause damage far greater than the situation ever required. In relationships, zero impulse control often appears as sudden outbursts of anger, sharp words spoken without thought, or actions driven by the emotion of the moment rather than by reason. It can look like raising a voice in public, sending a hurtful message during an argument, or making dramatic decisions in the heat of frustration. The issue is not that emotion exists. The issue is that it is allowed to take the wheel without the guidance of reflection. Impulse control is what allows you to feel intense emotion without letting it dictate destructive action. Without it, every disagreement becomes a storm, every inconvenience becomes an offense, and every feeling becomes a command to act immediately. People with low impulse control may later regret their actions, but regret cannot undo the words spoken or the damage done. Over time, those moments of loss of control chip away at trust, safety, and connection. The roots of poor impulse control often run deep. Some people grow up in environments where strong emotions were expressed without boundaries, so they never learned another way. Others may have been allowed to act out without consequence, believing that intense feelings justify any behavior. Still others may have faced the opposite, growing up in spaces where emotions were ignored or repressed, leading to an adult life where feelings erupt suddenly after being held in too long. You can recognize low impulse control by watching how someone reacts in moments of frustration or disappointment. Do they pause to consider their words, or do they lash out instantly? Do they take responsibility when their reaction causes harm, or do they justify it by saying they were just being honest or that the other person made them angry. The answer to these questions reveals more about their maturity than what they do on their best days. The impact of zero impulse control is not limited to romantic relationships. In friendships, it can look like starting unnecessary arguments or sharing private information in a moment of anger. In the workplace, it might appear as speaking rudely to a colleague in front of others or making rash decisions without consulting the team. These moments create an environment where others feel they must be careful and guarded, which slowly erodes collaboration and trust. Improving impulse control is possible, but it requires self-awareness and practice. It starts with noticing the physical signs of emotional escalation, the quickened heartbeat, the tightened jaw, the urge to interrupt or to act immediately. Then comes the choice to pause, even for a few seconds, and to ask whether this reaction will help or harm the situation. This is not about suppressing emotion, it is about giving emotion the space to be felt without allowing it to dictate behavior. For those in relationships with someone who struggles with impulse control, the challenge is to set boundaries that protect your well-being. This might mean stating clearly that certain behaviors are unacceptable, refusing to engage in conversations when voices are raised, or taking a break when discussions become too heated. Boundaries are not punishments. They are the structure that keeps the relationship safe enough for both people to grow. In the end, impulse control is not about becoming emotionless. It is about learning to lead your emotions rather than be led by them. When someone cannot manage this, they create a pattern where love and respect are repeatedly tested by moments of thoughtless reaction. And without change, those moments will eventually outweigh the good, leaving behind a relationship that is remembered not for its connection, but for its chaos. Another sign of emotional immaturity is the tendency to freely give criticism, sarcasm, or blunt opinions, yet react defensively or even aggressively when the same energy is directed back. This is the double standard of communication, where one expects others to accept their words with grace while feeling entitled to take offense when receiving feedback. It is a pattern that creates imbalance and tension in any relationship because it breaks the foundation of mutual respect. In romantic relationships, this often appears in the form of playful teasing that turns into hostility when the teasing is returned. One partner might make a joke about the other's habits in front of friends and expect everyone to laugh. But if the same type of comment is made about them, their mood shifts instantly. The atmosphere changes, and what could have been light-hearted becomes uncomfortable for everyone involved. This pattern is not always malicious in intent. Sometimes it is rooted in a lack of self-awareness, where the person genuinely does not realize how their words affect others. They may see themselves as honest or straightforward, believing that their bluntness is a sign of strength, yet when they are on the receiving end of similar remarks, they feel attacked. The truth is, emotional maturity requires consistency. If you believe honesty is valuable, you must be willing to receive it as well as give it. In the workplace, this imbalance can damage trust within a team. A leader who constantly points out mistakes but reacts poorly to feedback creates an environment where people are afraid to speak up. Over time, this fear leads to silence, and silence allows small problems to grow into larger ones. In friendships, it can lead to distance, as people learn it is safer to avoid certain topics altogether than to risk triggering defensiveness. The deeper issue here is often tied to self-image. People who can dish it out but cannot take it may hold a fragile sense of identity, one that feels stable only when they are in control of the narrative. Giving criticism allows them to maintain a position of authority or superiority, while receiving it threatens that image. This is why even gentle feedback can provoke an outsized reaction. You can recognize this pattern by observing how someone responds when they are confronted with their own behavior. Do they listen and reflect, or do they immediately deflect, justify, or counterattack? Do they treat feedback as an opportunity to grow, or as an insult to be defended against? The way they handle these moments reveals much more than their words in calm situations. Addressing this behavior requires a commitment to equality in communication. Healthy relationships are built on reciprocity, which means the same level of openness and respect applies to both sides. If you are willing to comment on someone else's behavior, you must be ready to hear comments about your own. This does not mean accepting disrespect, but it does mean holding yourself to the same standard you expect from others. For those dealing with someone who struggles in this area, the key is to remain consistent with your boundaries. Make it clear that respectful feedback is welcome in both directions, and that sarcasm or criticism is only acceptable if both people are comfortable exchanging it. If they are unwilling to meet this standard, it becomes a sign that the relationship may not allow for the kind of honest and balanced communication that builds trust. Ultimately, being able to take what you give is a marker of self-confidence and respect for others. It shows that you value truth over ego, growth over comfort. Without this balance, relationships become lopsided, with one person holding the right to speak freely while the other walks carefully to avoid conflict. And a relationship where one voice is always louder is a relationship where true connection struggles to survive. One of the most damaging signs of emotional immaturity is the tendency to attack the person instead of addressing the behavior. This is when disagreements turn into character assaults, when the focus shifts from the issue at hand to labeling the other person in a hurtful way. Instead of saying what you did hurt me, it becomes you are selfish. Instead of this action caused a problem, it becomes you are always a problem. These shifts are subtle in language but profound in impact because they move the conversation away from resolution and into the territory of personal injury. When personal attacks replace constructive discussion, the emotional cost is heavy. The person on the receiving end is left feeling devalued, not just for what they did, but for who they are. This kind of communication erodes trust and safety because it tells the other person that mistakes will not be discussed as actions that can change, but as evidence of flaws in their identity. Once that belief takes hold, it becomes much harder to engage in open dialogue without fear. In romantic relationships, personal attacks can surface during arguments that start over small issues. A disagreement about chores can suddenly spiral into "you never care about me" or "you are lazy." In these moments, the original topic disappears, replaced by sweeping judgments that are harder to forget than the argument itself. In the workplace, this might look like a manager telling an employee "you are unreliable" instead of pointing to specific instances of missed deadlines. The effect is the same in both cases. It leaves the person feeling diminished and defensive rather than motivated to improve. This behavior often comes from a lack of skill in expressing emotions without assigning blame to identity. Some people grow up in environments where criticism was personal, not constructive, and so they repeat what they learned. Others may resort to personal attacks as a way to win an argument quickly, knowing that targeting identity can cut deeper than addressing action. But what feels like a victory in the moment often plants seeds of resentment that will grow over time. The difference between addressing behavior and attacking character is respect. Addressing behavior says, "I value you enough to believe you can change this action." Attacking character says, "I have already decided what you are and it is not good enough." The first leaves room for growth. The second locks the other person in a box they did not choose and cannot escape. Recognizing this pattern is essential for protecting healthy communication. Notice whether conflicts in your relationship tend to escalate towards statements about identity rather than specific situations. Pay attention to the words "always" and "never," as they often signal that the conversation has shifted from the concrete to the absolute. Once you see the pattern, you can begin to choose language that keeps the focus on what happened and how it can be addressed. If you're on the receiving end of personal attacks, it is important to set clear boundaries. You can refuse to engage in conversations that target your character rather than your actions. You can state that you are willing to discuss specific behaviors, but will not accept labels about who you are. Over time, this consistent response can encourage healthier communication, or it may reveal that the other person is unwilling to change, in which case you will need to decide whether the relationship is worth preserving. Ultimately, replacing personal attacks with constructive dialogue is a choice that requires maturity, empathy, and self-control. It means resisting the urge to score points in an argument and instead choosing to protect the relationship even in conflict. When both people commit to addressing behavior instead of attacking identity, Disagreements become opportunities for understanding rather than battlefields for pride. And in that space, trust can deepen, respect can grow, and connection can survive even the hardest conversation. Emotional immaturity does not appear without a cause. It is shaped over years by the environments we grow up in, the examples we witness, and the coping mechanisms we develop to survive. Some people are raised in households where emotions are expressed without restraint, where shouting, blaming, and impulsive reactions are normal. In such settings, there is little opportunity to learn patience, empathy, or self-regulation. Others grow up in the opposite kind of environment, where emotions are ignored, dismissed, or punished, leaving them with no healthy outlet or vocabulary to express what they feel. Childhood experiences leave deep marks on how we handle emotions as adults. A person who is always shielded from consequences may never develop the resilience needed to face discomfort without lashing out. A person who was consistently criticized for showing vulnerability may learn to attack first in order to protect themselves from being hurt. Over time, these patterns become habits, and habits become identity, unless there is a conscious effort to change. Lack of role models also plays a significant role. When children do not see examples of respectful disagreement, honest self-reflection, and responsible emotional expression, they have little to guide them when conflict arises in their own lives. Without these examples, they may rely on instinctive, defensive, or aggressive responses, even when those responses damage relationships. Understanding the root causes of emotional immaturity is not about excusing harmful behavior. It is about recognizing that change requires more than awareness. It requires unlearning deeply ingrained patterns and replacing them with healthier ones. Only when someone accepts responsibility for their growth can they move beyond the limitations set by their past and build relationships grounded in trust, respect, and true emotional strength. Recognizing emotional immaturity early can save you from investing time and energy into relationships that will ultimately drain you. The signs often appear in subtle ways long before they show up in larger conflicts. One of the first clues is how someone handles small frustrations. Do they respond calmly when plans change unexpectedly, or do they react with irritation and blame? A person's reaction to minor setbacks often mirrors how they will handle bigger challenges. Pay attention to how they deal with feedback. Emotionally mature people can listen without turning defensive. They may not agree with every point, but they can respond without attacking. Immature individuals often shift the focus, make excuses, or counter with criticism of their own. This inability to receive input is a clear indicator of how they will navigate disagreements in the future. Watch for patterns in how they speak about others. Someone who frequently mocks, belittles, or assumes the worst about people who are not present may eventually treat you the same way when conflict arises. Equally telling is whether they take responsibility for mistakes or habitually place blame elsewhere. The key to spotting emotional immaturity is consistency. Anyone can behave well for a short time, but true character is revealed in unguarded moments. Look beyond the charm, the surface confidence, or the initial kindness, and notice how they behave when things are not going their way. These moments provide the clearest picture of the emotional maturity you will be dealing with in the long run. Dealing with someone who lacks emotional maturity can feel like walking through a field of hidden traps. You never know which step will trigger a reaction, which word will spark defensiveness, or which moment of honesty will be turned against you. Protecting yourself begins with understanding that you cannot control their behavior, but you can control the boundaries you set and the way you respond. The first step is to stay grounded in your own emotional state. Immature individuals often pull others into their turbulence, making you feel you must match their intensity in order to be heard. Resist this pull. When they escalate, you hold steady. This does not mean suppressing your feelings. It means choosing to respond in a way that protects your clarity and dignity. The second step is to define and enforce clear boundaries. Decide what kinds of communication you will accept and what crosses the line. If they resort to personal attacks, you can calmly state that you are willing to discuss the issue but will not engage in conversations that involve insults. If they continue, Remove yourself from the discussion until they are able to talk respectfully. Boundaries are only effective when you are consistent. So do not make threats you are not prepared to follow through on. The third step is to avoid personalizing their reactions. Emotional immaturity often leads to exaggerated responses that have more to do with their unresolved issues than with your actions. Remind yourself that their inability to manage emotions is not a reflection of your worth or value. This mental separation helps you avoid becoming defensive or internalizing their behavior. The fourth step is to decide whether this relationship is one you want to maintain. In some cases, the person may be open to growth and willing to work on their patterns. In others, they may resist change and continue to repeat the same behaviors no matter how clearly you communicate. Your responsibility is not to fix them, but to protect your own well-being. That may mean limiting your interactions or ending the relationship entirely if it becomes consistently harmful. Finally, invest in your own emotional maturity. The stronger your ability to stay calm, set boundaries, and communicate with clarity, the less likely you are to be drawn into unhealthy dynamics. Protecting yourself is not only about avoiding harm, it is about creating the space for healthier relationships to take root and thrive. Emotional maturity is not a destination you arrive at once and remain there forever. It is a lifelong process of self-awareness, responsibility, and growth. Every relationship, every conflict, and every challenge offers a mirror to see ourselves more clearly. The difference between someone who grows and someone who remains stuck is the willingness to look into that mirror without turning away. Recognizing emotional immaturity in others is important, but it is just as important to recognize it within ourselves. We all have moments where we react instead of respond, where we avoid accountability, or where we let pride speak louder than understanding. The goal is not perfection, it is progress. And progress comes from choosing to learn from those moments rather than repeating them. When you choose emotional maturity, you choose respect over impulse, listening over defending, and connection over control. You create relationships where trust can grow because both people feel safe to be honest and vulnerable. And even when you encounter those who have not yet made that choice, your own maturity becomes a shield, protecting your peace and guiding your decisions. In the end, emotional maturity is the foundation that allows love, friendship, and collaboration to thrive. It is the quiet strength that turns conflict into understanding and differences into growth. It is the commitment to show up not just as you are, but as the person you are becoming. And that commitment, renewed every day, is what makes the journey worthwhile.